The UK is under unprecedented threat from terrorism because of Russia's war in Syria. That's according to the head of MI6, who warns the risk is the highest it's ever been due to Russia's military support of President Assad.
Russia and the Syria regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The human tragedy is heartbreaking.
Also tonight, slapped down by Downing Street, Boris Johnson stands his ground over his criticisms of Saudi Arabia.
Do you understand the anger in the UK?
I don't understand it really.
Exclusive, the head of FIFA tells us she's puzzled by British upset over the poppy ban.
And a towering tragedy. The giraffe faces steady and silent extinction.
This is the ITV Evening News with Mary Nightingale and Alistair Stewart.
Good evening. The head of Britain's Secret Services today blamed Russia for what he called an unprecedented increase in the terror threat facing the UK. In his first public speech, MI6 boss Alex Younger said the Kremlin's support for the war in Syria and its high-tech subversion put Britain at risk.
He also warned that in Syria, so-called Islamic State is currently plotting more murderous attacks on British soil. He said his agents knew they were risking their lives when disrupting those plots. They'd seen off 12 in the last 3 years. Our security editor, Rohit Katru, has more.
Russia is reclaiming the obliterated streets of Aleppo. Today, their soldiers were recovering improvised explosives. Russia excels at mine clearance. At ceasefires, it is proving far less enthusiastic. From MI6, an organisation that exists in the shadows, this was a surprisingly blunt assessment of Russia's actions. It came from the man known as C, real name Alex Younger.
In defining as a terrorist anyone who opposes a brutal regime, they alienate precisely that group that has to be on side if the extremists are to be defeated. Meanwhile, in Aleppo, Russia and the Syria regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The human tragedy is heartbreaking.
His speech was about consequence as well as cause. He said Britain won't be safe until the Syrian civil war is over.
We cannot be safe from the threats that emanate from that land unless the civil war is brought to an end. As I speak, the highly organised external attack planning structures within Daesh, even as they face military threat, are plotting ways to project violence against the UK.
And yet Russia, not IS, was the target of Britain's top spy.
I think it reflects a general irritation that you find across government towards Russia as a partner that they find very difficult to deal with, both at a sort of diplomatic level but also at a sort of political level.
Syria might still be deemed to be the greatest threat, but this assessment says it's Russia's actions there that are now radicalising jihadists. This is not a brand new argument, of course, but it seems to be a subtle change in the British interpretation about what's happening in Syria, all unusually led from this place. Well, tonight the Russian embassy here in London hit back, saying that people are tired of anti-Russian propaganda.
Rohit Katru, thank you.
Other pressures in the Middle East have put Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in open conflict with the Prime Minister. He accused Saudi Arabia, a British ally, of engaging in proxy wars in the region. Well, Downing Street strongly disagreed and said the government fully supported the regime. But Mr Johnson is not backing down, and the timing could hardly be worse. He's due to visit the country on Sunday. Our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Shipp, reports.
The Foreign Secretary returned from a run this morning.
We're still allies with the Saudis.
And even before the sun was properly up, he was getting questions about our relationship with Saudi Arabia. His criticism of an ally had surfaced at quite the wrong time. Just a day after Theresa May returned from a trade charm offensive in the region, during which she met, dined with and gave a speech to the leader of Saudi Arabia, her foreign secretary had put those warm relations at risk because of what he'd said a week earlier at a conference in Italy.
You've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars. And it's a tragedy to watch it.
He was referring to Saudi Arabia's involvement in the Yemen, where Saudi military hardware is being used in the war there. Much of it is made in and sold by its ally, Britain. Downing Street supports the Saudis in this, and so Boris Johnson was slapped down. It is not the government's position, said Number 10.
I think he's definitely putting his foot in it. It's the last thing you want to say to Saudi Arabia, because we work with them on this sort of issue behind the scenes. And at the very moment when Mrs. May is making friends with the King of Saudi Arabia, to suggest that we have differences with them publicly is an own goal.
We in the UK are determined to continue to be your partner of choice.
When Theresa May addressed Gulf leaders yesterday, she sat next to the Saudi king and mentioned only in a delicate way the reforms in the country. Hearing her foreign secretary's words minutes after she landed in London last night was too much for Downing Street.
It's very difficult, isn't it, to have a foreign secretary who keeps saying things and then gets slapped down by the Prime Minister. How can any foreign country know what the British position is on anything?
Boris Johnson has clashed with Downing Street before. This, however, was the most severe spat between him and the Prime Minister. Now, I was in the room with Theresa May and those various Gulf leaders yesterday, and throughout Mrs. May's trip, it was clear how delicately she was treating relations. That explains why she was so furious with her foreign secretary. We agree with him on Iran, said Downing Street, but not Saudi Arabia. In turn, the Foreign Office here is furious at Downing Street for the very public and very severe way that Boris Johnson was reprimanded. Do not underestimate the severity of the row between the Prime Minister and her foreign secretary.
Kriship, thank you.
FIFA's Secretary-General has told ITV News she cannot understand the UK's anger over the ban on wearing poppies on Armistice Day. Fatma Samura insists the organisation's rules on political and religious symbols cannot be changed.
Tomorrow, FIFA's disciplinary committee will meet to decide what punishment, if any, to give to England, Scotland and Wales for flouting the ban, as our sports editor Steve Scott reports.
The potential repercussions were well signposted, but England and Scotland's football teams went ahead and wore poppy armbands on Armistice Day anyway. FIFA outlaws any political statements on shirts, and the poppy, it seems, falls into that category. FIFA's Secretary-General told me the home nations should not be given dispensation.
We just should not grant exception based on the fact that it's important to one nation. We are an international body composed by 211 member associations, and if we have to really consider the religious or the political or the cultural sensitivity, we should be open to consider it for everyone.
But the Royal British Legion firmly believes the poppy is a special case.
The poppy is not a political symbol. It's always been a symbol of remembrance and hope, but it's not political, it's not commercial, it's not a religious symbol.
FIFA's disciplinary committee will rule on the matter tomorrow and will hand down its verdicts next week. Do you understand the anger in the UK?
I don't understand it really.
Why?
Because to me, it's just something that people should be educated about. Every single country on this earth has something to remember. So if we authorize the FA to do it, they should be also having a possibility to give the opportunity of other member associations to do the same, and this is what we want to avoid.
England and Scotland's FA say they're convinced they've not broken any rules and are likely to fight any punishment. Wales, who wore black armbands only, were still charged, including for fans wearing poppies in the crowd. And FIFA's verdict on that alone is probably the most eagerly awaited of all their decisions, in the UK at least. Steve Scott, ITV News.
The Metropolitan Police has launched an investigation into child sex abuse claims at football clubs in London. The force said a team of specialist officers will look into the allegations, but refused to name those clubs being investigated.
And in the last hour, the Solomon Islands in the Pacific have been struck by a severe earthquake. A magnitude 7.7 quake has triggered a hazardous tsunami warning. The low-lying islands of Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea are most at risk.
Here, the arguments over who has the right to take the UK out of the EU wrapped up at the Supreme Court today. For 4 days, 11 justices have been hearing a case that could deliver a huge blow to the government's Brexit plans. Now they must decide whether the Prime Minister can trigger Article 50 or if Parliament should have a say first. Our political correspondent Emily Morgan explains.
It's the biggest court in the land, and this week, for the first time, all 11 justices sat together to hear a case, one that will decide the outcome of one of the biggest constitutional questions of our time. Today, the President of the Supreme Court clarified precisely what that is.
It bears repeating that we are not being asked to overturn the result of the EU referendum. The ultimate question in this case concerns the process by which that result can lawfully be brought into effect. As we have heard, that question raises important constitutional issues.
The justices must rule who has the right to kickstart the legal process of Brexit. Is it the government acting under royal prerogative, or is a bill required, giving Parliament the right to vote on triggering Article 50? The woman who brought the original case and won in the High Court says it's drained her, but she stands by her claim.
It's because the enormity of the case, in that it would set a precedent, though that the government could use a prerogative to take away rights on the domestic plane, is really does come home when you sit and hear all the arguments.
But the government's position throughout has never wavered.
In the end, what we've been saying is that there are powers in the hands of the government to do this. We've heard a lot about the royal prerogative, which sounds like a very outdated concept. In truth, this is something that is a crucial part of the modern constitution, and we need those powers to do the job that government is given to do.
Both sides have had 4 days to put their case here in the Supreme Court. Now all 11 justices must deliberate in private. If unanimous, a judgment will be written up. If not, a majority verdict needs to be reached, and that verdict will be delivered here in January. If the government lose, there's little time for the Prime Minister to draft legislation if she's to keep to her Brexit timetable. She will, though, accept the final verdict, one that will have huge political implications. Emily Morgan, ITV News in Westminster.
Still to come on the ITV Evening News, the House of Commons falls silent as an MP recalls being raped when she was just 14 years old.
I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell the police.
A powerful story and more of the day's news after the break.
Welcome back. An MP's harrowing account of how she was raped at the age of 14 moved her colleagues to tears today. Michelle Thompson said the attack left her so shocked she couldn't tell anyone, even her parents. But she insisted she was not a victim, but a survivor, and urged women to stand up for each other. Olivia Kinsley reports on the powerful words and the emotional reaction.
Michelle Thompson.
When I was 14, I was raped. As is common, it was by somebody who was known to me. He had offered to walk me home from a youth event, and I remember, first of all, feeling surprise, then fear, then horror, as I realised I quite simply couldn't escape.
The most personal of childhood ordeals told on the most public stage.
The most intimate of acts.
Sitting behind her, Roger Mullin was one of a number of MPs brought to tears.
Afterwards, I walked home alone. I was crying, I was cold and I was shivering, and I now realise, of course, that was the shock response. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my father, I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell the police. I bottled it all up inside me.
It has been previously rare to hear eminent people speak about their own horrific experiences of sexual violence. Campaigners hope this signals a new and much-needed openness.
It's a reminder that sexual violence is much more widespread than most people realise, that it affects people from all walks of life. And in her speech, she, in a very dignified way, talked about an incredibly traumatic personal experience.
Michelle Thompson finished her speech as she began, brave, open and incredibly powerful. Her colleagues won't forget it.
I'm not scared, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor.
Olivia Kinsley reporting, and you can see Michelle Thompson's moving speech in full on our website. That's itv.com/news.
Now, tributes have been paid to Greg Lake, the former frontman of the bands King Crimson, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who has died aged 69.
Said there'll be peace on earth, but instead it just kept on raining.
Lake was considered one of the founding fathers of progressive rock, but he also wrote one of the most loved festive hits, I Believe in Father Christmas. He died yesterday of cancer.
Now, giraffes are suffering a silent extinction and could be wiped out if their rapid decline continues. That's according to a conservation group. Africa has seen a 40% drop in giraffe numbers over the past 30 years. There are now less than 100,000 in the wild. In Eastern Africa, they've almost disappeared with a fall of 97%, but it's not all bad news. In Southern Africa, where conditions are right, numbers have more than doubled. Our science correspondent Alok Jha on what's behind the decline.
They're an iconic feature of the African savannah, but these animals, the tallest in the world, are under pressure. Farming and deforestation have ruined their habitats. As human populations have grown, these creatures have become endangered.
The decline of giraffe is a little bit like a silent extinction. Giraffe are everywhere in Africa, or they're assumed to be. But the biggest threats have been in East and Central Africa. So those populations, some of them, of the subspecies of giraffe, have declined by 95% in the last 3 decades.
Today, conservationists put giraffe on the vulnerable category of endangered animals, and they aren't the only ones in peril. Orangutans and gorillas have become critically endangered in the past year, and zebra have been added to the endangered species list, with their numbers dropping by almost a quarter since 2002. But it's not all bad news. Conservation efforts mean that the giant panda is no longer endangered, and tiger numbers are rising for the first time in 100 years. Being placed on the World Conservation Union's so-called red list is a call to arms.
It's very important, I think, for the world, the conservation community, the public, governments, to realise that an animal that we perhaps thought wasn't threatened at all is under these increasing pressures, and it really draws attention of all of us to this species and can make sure we put more conservation effort into conserving them.
Those efforts include the birth of a giraffe this week at the Port Limp Reserve in Kent. It's part of a European breeding programme aimed at increasing the numbers of these animals. Conservationists have spotted the problems for giraffe just in time. If we want to save them, they argue, we need to act now. Alok Jha, ITV News.
Sir Mick Jagger has become a father for the 8th time at the age of 73.
Yes, his partner, the American ballerina Melanie Hamrick, gave birth to a baby boy in New York today. The Rolling Stones frontman also has 5 grandchildren and a great-granddaughter.
And finally tonight, the inspiring teenager whose own misfortunes haven't stopped him helping others. Ethan Evans from Salford suffered sepsis and a hit and run at an early age to become a champion swimmer.
But there was more heartbreak to come when a stroke-like condition ended his dreams of success. So instead, he turned his talents to raising thousands for charity, earning him a Pride of Sport award. Damon Green went to meet him.
Ethan has won more sporting awards than he can count, and for a boy who was severely injured at the age of 8 in a hit-and-run collision, that's something in itself. Unable to play football, he turned to swimming as part of his therapy. Despite a series of medical conditions that might have stopped somebody less determined, now he swims to raise money for charity.
I've been through a lot in my short life, but I know there's people that have been through a hell of a lot more than I have, And for me to sit there and feel sorry for myself doesn't feel right. For me to go out there and help people feels right.
His thousands of pounds raised in years of work were recognised last night at a ceremony celebrating the best in British sport.
Ethan Evans' remarkable story.
And Ethan was there with his granddad, Ed, bursting with pride.
If I could sum up Ethan up in a few words, it would be compassionate, caring, inspirational.
What one thing have you learned along the way, would you say?
To do more.
You want to do more now?
Do more, yeah. Onwards and upwards. There's only one direction, that's up.
So another award for Ethan, only 14, but already an example to us all. Damon Green, ITV News, in Salford.
And that's all for now. Tom's back at 10.
But from all of us for now, a very good evening to you.
Bye-bye.